I get to a plateau of participants. The Zoom seems to let people in one person per second at a time. It's a rather peculiar piece of technology. Clearly, actually, we need to have our American Innovations webinar series end with something on Zoom, so we can be totally meta about this. All right. I have got people to a relative plateau, so I am going to say, welcome, everyone. I'm David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars, your moderator for our latest in our American Innovations webinar series. Now, this is on the Green Revolution, and I'm delighted to have as our three panelists, and I'll give you only briefly their names and accomplishments. Dr. Mohammad Alauddin is Honorary Associate Professor in the School of Economics at the University of Queensland, Australia, where his work focuses on developmental and environmental economics, author of several books, including The Green Revolution and Economic Development. Dr. John Perkins, a visiting scholar and research associate at the Center of Science for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society at the University of California, Berkeley, and Professor Emeritus of Biology at the Evergreen State College. His books include Geopolitics and the Green Revolution. Dr. Robert Zeigler has an extraordinarily distinguished CV, including Director of the Rain-Fed Lowland Rice Research Program at the International Rice Research Institute, from which position he went on to serve for another 11 years as Director General and CEO of the International Rice Research Institute as a whole. All of them have distinguished publications. Some of them should be appearing in the chat link quite soon so that you can go to Amazon and buy all their books, which you should. I will say that briefly and then talk a little bit, therefore, about the mechanics. I said the chat button. The three speakers are each going to speak for perhaps 12 to 14 minutes each conversationally. Then you, the audience, get to provide questions. Ideally, please put all your questions into the chat. Conceivably, the Q&A is an alternative, those buttons at the bottom. I will convey them to the speakers, who also have a chance to read them directly, talk to one another, also conversationally. When I do the questions, I do them in whatever order seems like it might make for a fun conversation, not chronologically. Don't worry if your question doesn't get asked during the talk. Please send any unanswered questions you want answered to me at randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward your questions to the speakers so they can have the option to answer you. So you can always get your questions answered, and you can always watch this, because this will be up on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours in perpetuity. So having said all that, Dr. Alauddin, may I ask if you'd be so kind as to speak first?
Well, it's a great honor to be a part of this great panel. And thank you, David. And I would like to thank the participants and the other panelists. I would like to provide a very brief introduction to my talk. And you see, the 1950s marked the emergence of many countries in Asia and to some extent in Africa as independent nation states, having been free from the shackles of colonialism. They had been struggling with high population growth, managing high expectations, high urge for industrialization, relative neglect of the agricultural sector, severe resource constraints, extremely high land-man ratio, and found it difficult to feed the growing population. One of the technological constraints was that biological technologies available at the time were not fully responsive to the application of higher doses of chemical fertilizers. By the 1960s, the situation started changing. due to the availability of dwarf varieties of rice and wheat developed by the International Rice Research Institute and the International Maize and Wheat Research Center, which were responsive to high doses of fertilizer and irrigation. Hence, the seed fertilizer irrigation technology is popularly known as the Green Revolution, which over time has dramatically transformed the agricultural sectors of many developing countries. These significant changes need to be judged as part of a continuum rather than a single event. The Green Revolution embodies many technology and policy antecedents in the Asian rice revolution and in the latter half of the 19th century Japan, and their spread to Taiwan and Korea in the 1920s and 30s. And in India, these stretch back to the early 20th century. Now, from now on, for the remainder of my presentation, I will illustrate various aspects of the Green Revolution with examples from Bangladesh. That's where I originally come from. Bangladesh has the most unfavorable and declining land-ban ratio. Too many people, too little land area, too small land area. So that is the basic premise, basic information, if I may put it that way. And it introduced the Green Revolution technology in different phases, starting in the early 50s with chemical fertilizers and mechanical irrigation in the form of low-lift pumps, shallow and deep tube wells. However, the Green Revolution did not assume much significance until the introduction of the biological component in the latter half of the 1960s. Now, what happened was that, as I said before, that Bangladesh is a very land scarce country, but whatever land was left to be brought under cultivation, that was exhausted by the time the Green Revolution technology came into existence, if you like. And the population pressure basically propelled the intensification of the agricultural process. Subsequently, agricultural intensification process. Subsequently, we found that irrigation, application of chemical fertilizers and other inputs in the process of agricultural intensification, primarily via sequential multiple cropping. Irrigation propelled expanded cropping during the dry season, led to the steady increase in cropping intensity just from 130% in 1960 to 200%, almost 200% by 2020. What impact did the Green Revolution have? Okay, one of the things is that different time trajectories for the seasonal diffusion of high yielding varieties of rice, dry season and wet season. This is some of the these are the two broad categories. Basically, it typifies two ecosystems, irrigated and rain-fed ecosystems. Slowdown in the pace of increase in more recent annual and seasonal outputs and yields. A varying pace of output and yield growth of dry and wet season HYV rice. Growth of annual and dry season HYV rice outputs and yields have been tapering off in the last decade or so, in contrast to those for the wet season. More even agricultural employment and availability of food grains throughout the year. a five-fold or quintupling of rice output and a substantial rise in food production resulted in higher per capita income over time and brought about a reduction in the incidence of poverty. The quadrupling of yield and a rise in agricultural labor productivity have placed Bangladesh on a high economic growth path. The Bangladesh experience is consistent with the theory, history, and empirics of agriculture's contribution to economic development. But you might ask the question, has there been any pitfalls from the Green Revolution? Yes, there have been some. They mostly relate to eco-environmental consequences and the unsustainable land use and land quality degradation. Micronutrient declined in many agroecological zones. Incongruity between crop suitability and cropping pattern. High use of agrochemicals and their adverse effects on the physical environment. Unsustainable water use, too much dependence on the groundwater. Dependence on a limited number, erosion of genetic diversity. Dependence on a limited number of rice varieties, high level of dependence on 5 strains of rice, and demonstrates the dependence on only a limited number of rice exposes Bangladesh to a high ecological vulnerability. There have been many rice species have been endangered, and some of them have been extinct. Next page, please. Where to from here? I think the Green Revolution, without Green Revolution, I must say that there would be starvation and most people would be living in poverty. That hasn't been the case. So hail the Green Revolution. However, given the pitfalls from it, we need to manage the Green Revolution sustainably. Given that agricultural production takes place in a complex and symbiotic system involving natural, technological, ecological, and environmental factors, the pitfalls of this process are deeply rooted in economics, sociology, ecology, and the environment. We focus on areas incorporating market-based policy instruments, science-driven policy choices, community and property rights-oriented policy possibilities, and institutional support-based policy options. While these options included in 1 to 4 may not provide an exhaustive list of instruments available to Bangladesh, they focus on some critically important areas. There is a figure at the bottom of this one. I'm more than happy to explain that, time permitting, later during question time. Thank you all.
And thank you so much. So delighted to hear from you. And we're going to go to our second speaker, Dr. Perkins.
So is the PowerPoint available? Yes. Thank you, David. And I'm honored to be a part of this panel talking about the Green Revolution. When I began this work, I was very struck by how much attention had been given to the consequences of the Green Revolution, which Mohammad has identified as quite profound, but very little about why was it launched. So the book, and next slide, please. The book I wrote, Geopolitics and the Green Revolution, was an effort to look back to see why the United States in particular became very interested in agricultural development issues outside of the United States. This was a very brand new form of activity for the United States, and it took some time to develop. Next slide. I envisioned the work I did as an environmental history, which meant that I was very interested in how people, for support of life, for development of material wealth, use nature for natural resources to support human societies. And we have an impact on nature, and in turn, nature has an impact on us. Next slide. Good, we have the whole slide here. And the scheme I used was that we, of course, use technology to access the resources of nature to supply our life and to supply our material wealth. But technology does not come free. It requires investment, certainly of labor, expertise, and money to develop the technology. And the Green Revolution, I believe, is best seen as a kind of investment in technology that was designed to extract more resources to support life and wealth. And if you do one more click there will be another, nope, go back. Yes, there. And there are, because investment deals with money and politics, the geopolitics, nationalism, national security always affect the decision-making of investors as to what to invest in and how much. And underlying this is, in fact, population. Not that population determines what the investments will be, but it certainly affects the magnitudes of investment needed and the types of technologies that might be useful. And now to the next slide. So I'm going to divide the talk into a couple of periods. A great deal happened in the United States before the 1940s that set the stage. The United States was an early mover toward what we now call modern agriculture, a set of technological. But suffice it to say that before the 1940s, American scientists and European and Japanese and others had learned to control variation. We could identify plants and livestock strains that were good genetically, and we could verify the strength of the goodness by statistical analysis. The United States was already an energy-intensive civilization, which gave us the wherewithal to make energy-intensive fertilizers, to build the infrastructure for irrigation and to operate that irrigation, lots of pumping of water to get it where you need it, and also to make and operate machinery. In addition, before the 1940s, serious efforts had begun to electrify the rural areas, most of which had not been electrified up at before the 1940s. And most probably most important, American agriculture changed from a way of life to a business. Farmers learned to use finance and debt management to invest in technology and to increase their incomes. As part of this modernization process, lots of people left agriculture and moved to cities. There was no longer, with mechanization, need for labor in the countryside. And we came to think of this as, this is what modern life entails. Most people do not farm, most people do other things in urban areas. One other thing that had begun heavy development was development of demographic science, and in the early 20th century, a revival of Malthusian pessimism about the ability of people to improve their status of life. Malthus famously said, you'll never get stable better life because population will simply keep increasing. And there was a revival of Malthusian factors in the before the 1940s, and also introducing the notion of exhaustion of environmental resources. Next slide. The 1940s themselves, I think, are best characterized in two phases. First was the war decade. After the immense devastation of World War II, there was a serious post-war food crisis from 45 to 46, which riveted attention on food supplies, particularly in Western Europe, somewhat in Japan. And this went up to the presidential and prime minister level of attention to resolve these crises. Another fact that happened was that the war alliance against Nazi Germany between the US, the UK, and the USSR collapsed into the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. In 1948, President Truman, in his inauguration, had 4 points that he wanted to emphasize. It's points 3 and 4 that I think are most important for our purposes. Point 3 was on military hard power. This called for the military treaty, which we now call NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to project American power to defend Western Europe. And point 4 was Truman's idea to project soft power, the technology, the expertise to improve living standards in foreign countries. Added to the sense of crisis, 1949, the USSR developed nuclear weapons. I see I have a typo. It wasn't 1049, it was 1949. And the Chinese Revolution in 1949 added to this sense of crisis as the decade ended. Next slide. During the 1940s, there was also reconstruction from the immense devastation of World War II. Indian independence came in 1947, which launched a new country free of the shackles of imperialism from Britain. And in 1948, two very popular books emphasized the importance of population and resource exhaustion. These codified what I would call neo-Malthusianism. And these books were very influential. I discovered from reading in the archives of the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation. These books had a profound impact on the thinking in the foundation. 1948, the Congress authorized the Point 4 program, which became the Agency for International Development. And in 1948 to 1951, the US supported the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. These were new activities for the United States to actively aid in the development of other countries' economies. Next slide. In the 1950s, both the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations began their programs. Paul Hoffman, who had headed the Marshall Plan, moved to be president of the Ford Foundation. And by the end of the year, Hoffman had established a New Delhi office in India. Doug Ensminger, as the head of it, had his experience and expertise in agricultural extension. It was very clear that Ford was going to be interested in agriculture. In the Rockefeller Foundation drew upon its first really major successful enterprise, the Mexican Agricultural Program, to develop high-yielding varieties in Mexico. And by the early 1950s, they turned their attention to India. A study, Notes on India Agriculture, outlined their strategy of what they wanted to do. And in 1956, the Indian Agricultural Program began with Rockefeller support. Next slide. In 1959, I think a decisive step was taken through the Rockefeller Foundation with support from the Ford Foundation to launch the Intensive Agricultural District Program in India. This was really the key step to make the Green Revolution successful. Before this time, Indian planners had two sorts of debates. First of all, should they do industry first, later turn their attention to agriculture? Prime Minister Nehru was a prominent spokesman for focusing on industry first. And the second was, if agriculture was to be improved, was it through social reform, or did it require new technology? In the late 1950s, there was a convergence. The debates over industry versus agriculture, or social reform versus new technology, came to a head. A severe drought reduced yields. At the time, government prices they had paid for grain that they procured from rural areas to finance industrialization were quite low. There was no incentive for farmers to raise much more wheat than they needed to survive because they couldn't make any money on it. The Ford Foundation spelled out this situation in their study, India's Food Crisis and Steps to Meet It. And the solution was to adopt the Intensive Agricultural District Program to bring new technology to the farmers best equipped to receive it. They had the finances, they had the water access, and they had the knowledge to handle the new technology and new financing. Next slide. I think there is one theory that I inferred the existence of that drove Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, and I called it the population national security theory. It went as follows. Overpopulation causes resource exhaustion, leading to hunger, leading to political instability, leading to communist insurrection, and danger to American interests and to war. This was to be avoided. And in particular, the Rockefeller Foundation used this very powerfully to focus on overpopulation and to get national yields up to eliminate hunger. Now, do I think this is a good theory to explain what's going on with the Green Revolution? Well, not entirely, but I did become convinced that it was very powerful in motivating the activities and the decision-making within the foundations. Next slide. And so by the 1980s, it was clear that the investments in technology and technology transfer allowed India to use its natural resources of soil, genetic seed resources, water, sun, combined with high-yielding varieties of fertilizer, water development. This was to improve Indian food supplies, Indian life, and the Indian economy. And this is what drove the population national security theory, I believe, was very influential in driving particularly the Rockefeller Foundation to emphasize technology transfer. And next slide, please. So this is a very quick run through what was quite a complex set of changes. And to get more details, you'd have to read the book. But this is a nutshell encapsulation of what I believe happened to make launching the Green Revolution possible. And I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. Delightful, wonderful to have that too. And then for the third and final of our panelists, Dr. Zeigler, may I ask if you would be so kind? You're still muted.
Yeah, okay, now I'm unmuted. And if we could start my presentation. First, I'd like to thank the organizers, National Association of Scholars, for putting this together and inviting me to talk. And I have a very easy job now. My two previous speakers have made most of the key points, and so I'll just have the luxury of emphasizing them. So first point, let's see, that's TMI. Okay, here we go. First point, again, thank you for inviting me. And this is a disclaimer. This is a bit of a bait and switch. I'm not going to be talking about the 50s or American innovation. My previous speakers have done that, but I will provide a rice perspective to the Green Revolution. Next, please. So back in when I was in college, these were the literature that we were reading that was basically a doom and gloom. Next, they basically said that the Malthusian prediction that we just heard about, that the Earth is incapable of supporting a growing population, that was the norm, that starvation was going to happen and that there was no alternative. And Asia, in particular, India and Bangladesh, would be basket cases and unable to feed themselves, and we should just forget about it and let them all starve. That was one consensus. The other consensus from the Rockefeller and Ford foundations were, no, we can apply the tools of science and change the future. It is not inevitable. Next slide. And that gave rise to the Green Revolution. Rockefeller and Ford Foundation invested in science and technology, as Mohammad had mentioned, creating the International Rice Research Institute and the Wheat and Maize Center in Mexico, and gave rise to the Green Revolution. In the 1960s, the yields of rice in Asia were about 1.5 tons per hectare. Widespread famines were the norm, with any sort of moderate drought, and more were predicted. Today, however, we're getting 3 times the yield on the same land, and I think there's general consensus that the Green Revolution, the stable increased production in rice, led to the Asian economic miracle that we talk about today. And this slide just illustrates the nature of the change. The rice variety in the middle, very tall, was typical of the kinds of rices that were grown at the time. Erie scientists realized that if they could reduce the height of the plant, they could increase the yield. What was happening was that with addition of fertilizer, the plants would just grow tall and fall over. They wouldn't add grain. With the new semi-dwarf varieties that the breeders developed, this plant here on the left that you can see, IR8, if you added fertilizer, it added more grain. It did not add more leaves and stems, and it stayed erect, so you could double or triple the yield. Next slide. And it was a very simple process. The plant breeders basically made a cross between a few different varieties. These boxes represent the names of rice varieties, different parents, and they produced the IR8, the first miracle variety, they called it, of rice in Asia. I just want to keep you in mind that this is a very simple kind of cross that yielded the first rice variety that opened the Green Revolution. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, a key to the Green Revolution, however, was not simply the technology of new rice varieties that would give high yields if you had fertilizer. There was a whole set of policies that came together to enable that technology to reach its full expression in rice fields. As Mohammad mentioned, international rice research centers were created. I think, but even more importantly, there was a consensus among lending agencies, aid agencies, and governments that if we could increase the ability to get information to farmers, building an extension system, that would make a major difference. Likewise, investing in irrigation and road infrastructure and electrification in the rural areas also enabled adoption of the modern technologies, and affordable fertilizer, offered by subsidies, which had its own set of problems, could also enable the expression of this new technology. But I think the fact is that it's a recognition that was technology and enabling policies that allowed us to enjoy the fruits of the Green Revolution. Next slide, please. And this is an illustration of the growth in production area and yields. If you look at this graph, the red line from 1960 on the left all the way to 2013 on the right, the red line shows the harvested area of rice over the last 53 years. And you'll see that it's essentially flat. while the production in green shows a steady increase. And basically, we've had production increase fourfold with less than a doubling of the area. Much more efficient production of food for the region. Next slide. And if you look at this, the urbanization trends in Asia, it almost mirrors exactly that slide, the rice growth. If you look from 1960s onward, you see most of the people lived in the blue area, the rural areas, illustrated by blue, and a relatively small part of the population lived in red. As rice production became much more efficient, production increased, food was more abundant, it was much less expensive. A number of people gave up producing rice and moved to the cities where opportunities were much greater for themselves and especially for their children. So we've seen a huge drive in the change in the face of Asia, supported by the Green Revolution. Next slide, please. Now, when the original growth of the Green Revolution across Asia was spectacular, as Mohammad indicated. However, it came with quite a few problems, as he indicated as well, and I won't go through that. But as our scientists were working beginning in the 1960s, they recognized that while the yield was good, there were so many problems with pests, insects, diseases, weeds, proper fertilizer management, water management, etc., that there was an enormous research challenge facing that. How can we develop the tools and the knowledge base that will allow farmers growing rice in very different environments to use the best practices available, knowing full well that the best practices in one area may not necessarily be the best practices in another. So there was from the 1970s and 80s, after the first flushes of success in the Green Revolution, major investment has been to make the varieties more adapted, the production systems more sustainable, and farmers' livelihood much more attractive. Next slide, please. And just to give you an example of the kind of breeding that was required to bring in the traits that were needed, the disease resistance, the insect resistance, etc., you'll recall, or drought tolerance or flood tolerance, you'll recall that first cross for the first modern variety was 3 or 4 or 5 plants. This is the IR72, the most recent, one of the more recent varieties from Erie. You can say it had dozens and dozens of crosses and took decades to accomplish. Next slide, please. And this illustrates the progress from the initial steps of the Green Revolution in the 1960s, all the way through. The names across the bottom axis represent new rice varieties, just as an example. All of the features across the bottom represent changes in improvements in the rice plant and different aspects of rice physiology. Above the red line is the advances in agronomy and crop cultivation practices. And you can see the red and black represent the growth in rice yields over time. A steady increase in rice yields contributed by advances in both the plant biology as well as cultivation practices. I hope this will be available and people can study it at their leisure. Next slide. So we have, and we're not able to share this, but we have a steady, continuous growing demand for rice. There had been predictions that demand for rice would drop off, but we're seeing that is not happening over the past 20 years. We have highly productive areas that are threatened by sea level rise. The delta areas of Asia produce much of the world's rice. They're threatened by sea level rise and, of course, other aspects of climate change. Fewer people are going to be growing rice, so we have to become far more efficient in our rice plots. We're looking at intensifying our rice production, while changes in demand for superior grain quality, nutritional value, food safety, etc., are putting more stringent requirements on our rice varieties. We're looking at a demand for higher yielding varieties and more crops per year. So a huge amount of pressure on future rice growing. Next slide, please. And we have recognized that we've got to work with our farmers to allow them to have the tools to meet the demands that society is placing on them in terms of food production. And we've placed ourselves and our colleagues, this is just an example of some of our partners across Asia, who've worked on developing specific nutrient and pest management practices for farmers around the world. And this is a work that's been going on for decades. It's all part of the Green Revolution. Some might say Green Revolution 2.0, but it's an ongoing challenge. It's not something you do once and let it sit on the shelf. It's continuous requirement of innovation and research to create the next technological breakthroughs that are needed. Next slide, please. So about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, the International Rice Research Institute and the United Nations Development Environment Program, UNEP, realized that we had a lot of tools for improving the sustainability of our rice program, but they weren't put together in any kind of coherent package. And there wasn't necessarily agreement amongst all the players in the rice world as to what made sustainable rice. So we convened a sustainable rice initiative with the idea of creating a platform that would establish unambiguously what it takes to produce sustainable rice, to produce rice sustainably. What are the metrics for determining that, how you can measure that, and then unbiasedly determine whether or not rice produced by a particular farm is sustainably produced or not. That is a demand from consumers that we are improving the footprint of rice on the environment. And that sustainable rice platform is now underway. It's functioning. It brought together the thinking of the private sector, multinational chemical companies, multinational traders, multinational environmental groups, all sat down and over years had an extraordinarily contentious, but ultimately very productive effort to create a universally agreed set of sustainable production practices for rice. And so we're in a situation where the Green Revolution has gone through its course. It has gone through a major process of adjusting the weaknesses, trying to react to the weaknesses of the Green Revolution, recognizing that it is a demand for renewed investment in research to allow us to arrive at that goal. Next slide, please. I think so. Well, challenges that we've got to adapt to climate change. Our production systems are going to have to respond to a global demand to reduce our environmental impact of agriculture. We're going to increase the productivity of our existing systems. We have to increase the quality and the nature of our products coming out of our agriculture. And basically, it's going to be a fundamental change to not only our agricultural systems, but to our crop plants as well. I think our next slide, which should be the last one, I think. Oh, no, one after that. So we're looking at a science-based green revolution where we will be tapping into the revolutions of genetics and molecular biology and plant physiology. We have had major advances in our understanding of microbiology in the soils and chemistry to better understand how our crops extract nutrients from the soil and how that can be sustained. We recognize that the remote sensing and crop modeling abilities that the computational capacity and big data are giving us will allow us to better appreciate and model how our production systems interact with our ecosystems. And finally, we need to make sure that our political and social players in our societies, first of all, can appreciate the complexities and subtleties in agriculture and technology development, and respect and allow that technology to express itself in the field without undue interference. So with that, I would thank again the organizers for allowing me to participate in this and open up for all of our questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And yes, I encourage everybody to put in questions into the chat button at the bottom. I'm going to start out with a question. How did the Green Revolution integrate training of people in, Bangladesh, India, China to be, the agronomy PhDs themselves, the people who are coming up with the ideas and the research themselves? And so it's not just PhDs from America, Europe, coming in with the science, to make it, how should I put it, the human capital sustainable within each country also. As I say, I presume this is part of what happened. How did that happen? To all, but I see the hand first from Dr. Zeigler.
Yeah, that's a great question. We at Erie and at CIMMYT and in many of the other similar centers, we had a very, very aggressive capacity development program. We brought, certainly, I think we have trained over 15,000 scientists from Asia on rice, primarily from Asia on rice science. We had a partnership with a number of universities around the world, so students from Asia could do a degree in one university and do field research at Erie. So we had short-term training programs all the way through PhDs and postdoctoral fellows. And then Erie and CIMMYT also worked very closely with countries, helping them establish their national rice research institutes. Bangladesh, many dear friends in Bangladesh. BRI, the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, Erie worked very hard to help Bangladesh establish that institute. So, yeah.
And Dr. Alauddin?
Actually, I would like to compliment what Dr. Zeigler has said, that without the great efforts, research efforts of Bangladesh Agricultural Rice Research Institute, people would be simply starving. They have kept us alive. On the positive, on another side, of course, Bangladesh has been able to significantly reduce its population growth rate. From almost 3% per year in the late 60s and early 70s to just over 1%. So that is something that has helped. And also the training of international scientists, if you like. I read a book, a classic, if you like, a book by International Development and Agriculture and International Perspective by Hayami and Ruta. And they talk about the Japanese scientists training abroad. But what happened was, those who came home, they learned a lot, but they could not translate that their expertise into action in the Japanese setup. So what they did was, they, it is like a program, like you spend some time there, some time locally, and then that paid high dividends to Japanese rice research, if you like. So that's how it developed. And Bangladesh, or for that matter, other countries in the region, rice growing regions, have also profited from that collaboration. More or less, it's like a hands-on, it's an excellent collaborative venture, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Perkins, did you want to add?
Yes, the question is very good. And what impressed me as I was trying to unravel the historical pathway of starting the Green Revolution in the 50s and 60s was the high emphasis on training, particularly by Rockefeller staff, both in Mexico and in India. And I'll just make two comments here. One was an observation that Norman Borlaug, who worked as the developer of some of the first high-yielding wheat varieties that were successful in Mexico and also in India, commented that one of the factors he faced in Mexico was many of the Mexicans who found the wherewithal to attend university certainly did not intend to find themselves working outside in the hot conditions of agricultural science. Borlaug grew up on a farm. He was well used to the physical labor. He did a lot of physical labor himself, and he found that many of the students who were interested in agricultural science, they expected it to be a pathway to where you didn't have to do that sort of work. And he had to emphasize that, and the Rockefeller Foundation, I think, was quite successful in helping Mexican agronomists rise to the challenge of, yes, you were going to do very advanced scientific work, and yes, you were going to be out in the hot sun doing the field studies. The second comment I'd make is that in India, the government of India at the national levels at the start of the Green Revolution reflected Mr. Nehru's penchant for industry over agriculture. And it was the Indian agricultural science establishment, which at independence was actually far better developed because of institutions that the British had brought into India. And I think it was the agricultural scientists who were very important in persuading the national leadership of India that agricultural science was very important, and the Rockefeller Foundation supported the development of the Indian Agricultural Research Institute to train master's and PhD level agronomists to do the work of constantly innovating and getting ever new technology developed. And so those scientists played a very important role and made many important contributions to the science itself for developing the high yielding wheat varieties. So to me, the marriage between the work of the foundations and the .4 program and the promotion of higher education, which is really essential for highly productive agriculture, was very, very close.
Thank you. I see questions, but I'm going to follow up with one more on my own, just because I want to see how you handle a possible critical question. There was one of the earlier presentations mentioned that the Green Revolution, India in particular, they decided to focus on farmers who were capable of adapting the techniques. To what extent, therefore, did the Green Revolution help rich farmers to outcompete poor farmers? And to the extent that that was a tendency of the Green Revolution, what was done to counter effect that tendency?
That is a terrific question. It was one that when I began my research on the Green Revolution, I thought I might be able to unravel and develop an answer for that question. I will confess that to this day, I have not, in my own mind, begun to think that I have done anything to unravel that question. And it goes back to the debate that I found within India itself, within the government of India, as to whether India should become a modern country first by developing steel and chemical industries and electrification, or whether they needed a highly productive agriculture to support an industrial development. Western Europe and the United States had highly productive agricultures that supported modernity through industrialization. For that one, I think the answer is they needed the agriculture to support the industry. And so the new technology was very important. And the debate eventually settled on India will do the agriculture, emphasize the agriculture first, and that will have beneficial effects on Indian industrialization. The second issue was when the Indian agricultural intensification project began, questions of social reform, huge inequalities in the rural countryside and in urban India too, still prevail in India. And the talk of social reform, which had been very high in the early days of independence with projects in Uttar Pradesh and in Punjab, seemed to me to fall by the wayside. That the pathway of let's get new technology, let's get it developed and deployed, educate the farmers to use it. So it became a technology transfer was a faster way to success than the difficulties of social reform to make India more egalitarian. And I think that situation may still prevail, that India still has substantial undernourishment in its population, which is usually people do not have access to food. They do not own land, they don't own enough land, or they work at wage labor in the cities and they don't have enough money to buy food. So the social reform that was initially envisioned at Indian independence by Indian leaders, such as Nehru, in my mind, have still not been solved. And I'll just add, for that matter, they're not solved in the United States either. We have a highly inegalitarian society, which does create problems. It's a very complicated subject, so I think I'll just end it there because it's complex.
And Dr. Alauddin.
Yes, I think, it's a very fascinating story provided by Dr. Perkins, and I commend him for that. I would like to add that, the distributional consequences of the Green Revolution technology, that has been an intense debate in the earlier part of the Green Revolution. It continued until the mid-1980s, and then, of course, the focus shifted to environmental consequences, so on and so forth. But coming back to the distributional consequences, I came across a book published by the International Labour Organization, and there are two contrasting patterns of the Indian Punjab and the Pakistan Punjab. I think one of the things that emerged from there was that the land distribution itself was more egalitarian in the Indian Punjab than in the Pakistan Punjab, and that's why the distribution was, relatively speaking, more egalitarian. And coming back to the adoption by the richer farmers or more resourceful farmers, it is more or less, it varies from society to society. In my book on the Green Revolution in Bangladesh, I did some field work for that book. It came out of my PhD thesis, and I found that there are certain areas, the two areas. One, the richer farmers, quote unquote, they were the pioneers, they are the leaders, and the poorer farmers were the or smaller farmers, if you like, were the laggards in technology adoption. But there is no such thing in another area, which is in the eastern part of Bangladesh, and you may have heard the name of Kumilla model by Professor Akhtar Hamid Khan, and that was it's in the laboratory area of Bangladesh Academy for Rural Development, and the land distribution is relatively more egalitarian. So it varies whether some social parameters can determine the distributional outcomes as well, and I think that point has been quite well addressed by Dr. Perkins. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Dr. Zeigler.
just a very quick remark on this. I think let's make sure we're using the words properly. There's rice growers have about a hectare or half a hectare typically that they're growing, maybe 2 hectares. A very large rice farmer might have 5 or 10 hectares. These guys aren't rich. Okay, so there is a differentiation within the Green Revolution, and that those farmers who were on land that was amenable to irrigation benefited more than those people who did not have access to benefit. So that was the real driver. It was access to reliable water for both wheat and rice. And those farmers who were happened to be growing and living in those areas were the first to benefit. The economic growth that took place as a result of those higher yields that I'm sure Dr. Alauddin knows, Rita Sharma, they wrote some very interesting work on the economic growth in the Punjab after the Green Revolution, in Indian Punjab. In 1974, just a few years after the beginning of the Green Revolution, their conclusion was that there were a lot of big losers, that the wealthy benefited, or those who had the good land benefited, the others did not. When they came back 10 years later in the mid-80s, they found that that wealth had moved through the rural communities, and that those people, those families who were not perceived as benefiting early on, actually had benefited from local repair shops that were repairing small machinery, from selling products to farmers who had money to buy, et cetera. So the overall rural economy was lifted. So, but yes, there was inequality, but I think we need to look at that in context.
Thank you. I am going
That's
to move
very
there.
clear. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to move from there to a question from an actual member of the audience, though I'm going to push on it a bit. From Stu Reuter, how detrimental to the Green Revolution have been the ideas of the Chinese Communist Party? I want to push on that. What is the specific history of the Green Revolution in China? Is there some sort of like deep freeze where it doesn't even start getting adopted till the 1980s? Is it a Green Revolution with Chinese characteristics? I'm going to presume that China is a huge part of the story and that it's not identical to everywhere else, but everybody tell me. And in particular, did Chinese communist ideology have any inhibitory effects, for Mr. Reuter's question?
Well, I will say just real quick, the Chinese Communist Party adopted modern technology, irrigation, and they were going to go full blown into this. Remember the Great Leap Forward in 1959, I think it was, John, you'll remember this better than I, but that Chinese misconception to try to go full hog forward on whatever they thought was the best technology ended up in a catastrophe. Pol Pot tried to copy that in Cambodia, ending in a catastrophe. However, after the mid-1980s, China really did take up. They built the Chinese National Rice Research Institute. We worked on them with. They did a very systematic investment in research. And they then did establish their own Green Revolution, developing hybrid rice, building on Erie materials that they didn't own up to until 10 years ago, but still. So the Chinese, after a pretty bad false start, did embrace the components of a Green Revolution, including a very aggressive extension program. And they did embrace it in a way that in some ways emphasized some of the worst characteristics of the Green Revolution. Egregious abuse of fertilizer and pesticides to the point that they've got very serious groundwater contamination problems. They were probably well, I'll stop there. John has a point he would like to bring up, so.
Well, it's just another sidelight on, what the Chinese have done. When the Indians were debating whether social reform or new technology was the most important, apparently, they were getting the notions of social reform from the Chinese. from Mao's new regime in China, which was going to make a much more egalitarian society. The Indians, for probably a variety of internal forces acting in Indian politics, plus the urging of the Americans from the government, the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, decided that China did not provide the right answer. And so the Indians, I think can be said, were faster out of the block to embrace the new technology. One thing I'll just compare this to the United States. When the United States modernized its agriculture, the rural sociologists in this country often speak of people were either pulled out of farming or they were pushed out of farming. Those who were pulled saw opportunities and left the farm. Often this was inter-family decision-making where the oldest son was going to inherit the farm and the younger children scattered to the cities, went to college, got their educations, and probably had a richer life. And some people were pushed, particularly Black farmers out of the South. Modernization was something that they did not receive the assistance that white farmers did. A lot of Blacks migrated. It was probably a bit of pull and a bit of push that caused that migration. But the inequality in American agriculture at the modernization was quite profound. And some of the stories about turning farms in this country to modern operations compared to more primitive ones, some are very happy stories and some are not so happy stories. It's a very complicated mix. Mm-hmm. Certainly John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, a famous American novel, pictures poor white farmers out of Oklahoma being pushed to California by mechanization. There was no more work in the countryside. And of course, his story is a tragic story, but a lot of people who came to California found much better conditions. It's very hard to generalize. Was it good or bad? It was a mixture. Some people suffered and some people benefited. Over time, some of the benefits, I think, have begun to outpace the hardships, but the hardships were real at the time.
And Dr. Alauddin, did you also want to speak to this?
No, I think I have little knowledge about China, but I can just want to come back to one point made by Dr. Perkins, that India, well, there are two parts to it. One is among the Indians, there is a lot of Chinese followers. That is one of the things. So there is a fair bit of Maoist influence that still persists. But having said that, the American influence came through the international organizations and a World Bank mission led by Sir John Crawford, an Australian, and that met the then agriculture minister, Mr. C. Subramaniam. He is known as the father of the Indian Green Revolution. So that is one thing, and that pursuit. And I fully agree with the view that in the 50s, especially in the second five-year plan, 1955 to 60, this plan emphasized industry. It is almost bordering on industrial fundamentalism, rather than agriculture and industry going together, or even agriculture given greater emphasis to some extent so that it can it can promote, it can encourage industrialization, like what happened in Europe and the United States, agrarian revolution preceding the industrial revolution, if you like. So that's some of the things. I think that's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so. I'm going to switch to a question from Hans Moeller. It's directed to Dr. Zeigler, but for everyone, obviously. Well, within your sustainable.org, how do the multinational fertilizer companies highly depending upon fossil fuels fit into the new ideas of soil health and sustainability, which actually tend to decrease fertilizer use? And this does come, there is an awful lot here in this, but just generally the role of high-tech fertilizers. And I guess I'd say, can you speak to both the pure agronomical question about whether high-tech fertilizer use is good and sustainable, and then I suppose the political economic question: how much does it integrate a variety of green revolution countries into dependence upon imports from abroad? Sorry, and you're muted.
Yeah, we have dogs and they tend to bark, and so if I'm not muted, they'll take over the conversation. Yeah, it's a good question. The key principle is that the crop should extract from the soil, or I'm sorry, you should add nutrients to a crop only to the extent that it extracts them from the soil. That is, the grain is going to be removing nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and other nutrients in fertilizer. So you want to add what that plant is taking out. If you do not replace what its plant takes from the field, it is going to run down, and you will destroy your soil environment. So the question is not whether fertilizer use is sustainable. It's essential to replace nutrients that you take out. The question is, what is the nature that you replace? How do you replace them, and how do you know that you're replacing them at the right amount so that you don't have a nutrient toxicity in your soil? So the fertilizer industry that I've been having conversations with is interested in a sustainable use of their product. There's enough demand for fertilizer that they can make plenty of money. So the challenge is to make sure, and this is what that SRP, Sustainable Rice Platform, one of the things it's working definitely towards, is making sure that the balance between what your crop takes out of the soil and what you put in by a fertilizer is equal and not out of balance. Not every country can produce its own fertilizer. So importing of nutrients is a reasonable approach. If you look at some less informed so-called solutions where we're going to use animal fertilizer and plant residue, etc., if you do the calculations, the amount of land that you require to capture the nutrient demand for our food need, the amount of area that we would have to put under production would be unacceptable, and we'd be going into natural areas, clearing forests to grow food, etc. So I think the secret of with fertilizers is having the information around your crop management that you can add precisely the amount of fertilizer that is needed, and that is our objective. Precision fertilizer application, as well as pesticide, etc.
Thank you.
And if I can chime in on this question, it is a very good one, and in my view, it's a very difficult one for the reasons that Bob mentioned, and I'll just pile on a few more reasons. I have yet to be convinced that it would be possible to have an adequate diet for 8 billion people without the fertilizer industry. Maybe somebody someday will do some calculations and modeling that will persuade me otherwise, but I don't see it at the moment. And certainly, once you have particularly a dependence on replacing the nitrogen supplies, the nitrogen fertilizer was one of the real keys to the Green Revolution high yields. And that came largely through the Haber-Bosch process developed in the early 20th century. And we now add substantial amounts of kilograms per hectare of nitrogen fertilizer all over the world. And in the soil, that gets transformed by bacterial action into nitrous oxide, which after carbon dioxide and methane is the third most important greenhouse gas. So I think we have a dilemma. There was a conference in India earlier this year that I participated in, where to me, this was the central dilemma. If nitrogen fertilizer requires fossil fuels to produce and releases carbon dioxide as you produce the nitrogen fertilizer, and if the nitrogen fertilizer itself turns into a greenhouse gas, then clearly this is a problem. How do you keep the benefits of the fertilizer without aggravating the climate change situation? And I was very glad when Bob mentioned climate change as the coming challenge to sustainability. Already we are seeing effects on yields, effects on farm labor, effects from sea level rise and infusion of salt water into coastal farming areas. This is a really difficult challenge. We have to keep the fertility high enough to get the yields to feed the people that exist. And nobody wants to say, oh, I'll be glad to go without the food, so there'll be more for others. People don't seem to like that solution very well. And so the fertilizer dilemma that we face is really severe. And I think part of the answer is going to come from the ability to make through renewable electricity, to make ammonia without stripping hydrogen from methane that we do now. So it's a very serious problem, and I don't think we have nearly seen the development of adequate answers to this dilemma right at the moment. It's a problem for the future to solve.
Thank you. Dr. Alauddin.
No, I don't have anything.
All right. In that case, I'm going to go to a question from Anthony Hayner. Thank you so much for your informative presentations. Can you comment on the important role of culture in shaping which innovations are in fact adopted? And he says, I have in mind in particular current research on developing synthetic meat, which clearly would reduce the release of methane. But I will add, if you have any other examples which would appeal to you to talk about, welcome to hear, to any and all.
I'll take a stab at it. It's an excellent question. The people who have adopted vegetarian diets, I think, are doing everybody else in the world a favor. Because so much of the grain used in the world, maize, wheat, I don't know that rice goes very often to livestock feed. But to produce the meat and the dairy products and the eggs, the butter, the cheese that many people enjoy is a very heavy drain on agricultural resources, because it takes a lot of grain to support those animals. And the animals spend a lot of that energy keeping themselves alive. So the food we get from animals is much more intensive requirement of resources than if we just eat the vegetarian materials directly. And certainly I've learned a little bit of Indian cooking, and I am now fully convinced you can make really good food, purely vegetarian. You just have to add the right spices. That makes it all the difference in the world. And I think this is very strong culturally, and I think the vegetarians actually have a cultural lesson to teach the rest of the world, and I will be the first to confess I'm not a vegetarian. I think I should be, but I'm not. So I apparently have some learning to do myself.
Why, there are the others to talk about culture in shaping which innovations of the Green Revolution are in fact adopted.
Well, I think in terms of rice, if you look at the cultures across Asia, rice is an integral part of their culture. It figures in the creation stories, all important events in life, rice plays a role in. So one would think that rice varieties would be very important to culture, and they are. There are many different rice varieties, different specialty cultivars, etc. They're only used maybe in weddings or in birth celebrations or what have you. So I think in general, one has to be increasingly, as consumers become more sophisticated, increasingly aware of where that rice is fitting into their daily practices and habits and customs. In the early days of the Green Revolution, where people were very short of food, they would eat the early varieties that had, how shall we say, challenges in terms of their cooking quality, etc. As consumers gained more income, they became more picky. Rice cultivars, the modern rice cultivars, became better quality. But the fact is that if they would not fit in the either culinary regime or cultural regime, they wouldn't be adopted. And we had many rice varieties that were not adopted.
I completely agree with that. I have some evidence. Well, we have experience in Bangladesh like that. And Bangladesh is probably the most rice intensive country in the world in terms of both dietary habits as well as in terms of cultivation. Yeah, and I think, gradually, some 40 years ago, 50 years ago, any rice would be eaten by almost everybody. That is not the case anymore. And the fine grained rice that is coming into, into people's list, actually, regardless of which strata of the society you belong to. Relatively speaking, I mean, even people in the lower stratum of the society, they at least have, well, some days, if you like, or so on some occasions, they will go to eat the finest grain quality of rice. So that is one of the things. And I'm not quite sure about the synthetic mate. I don't think that fits the culture of the Indian subcontinent very much. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but they are very, very sensitive to that type of synthetic meat or whatever, But I have no idea. My other two panelists might have better ideas about that. Thank you.
And Dr. Perkins, I believe I saw your hand just a little earlier.
Well, just a very short story I came across about the new varieties of high-yielding wheat in India when they first appeared. Many Indian consumers were used to white-colored wheat, and the new varieties hadn't bred them into white forms yet, so they had the red color. And for chapatis, this was considered just not acceptable. I don't think it was a deeply embedded religious belief, such as many vegetarian cultural traits are, but it certainly was. When someone went to the store to get wheat or flour for chapatis, they were the wrong color, they were frowned upon. It was a quality that people weren't used to, they didn't like. Some got used to it, and eventually the right color varieties were bred to solve the problem.
Thank you. I'm going to have one more question before we get to our conclusion, also from Hans Moeller. It also seems the sustainability model could apply as well to crops here in the United States. I again want to expand. To what extent have techniques pioneered for the Green Revolution been applied to United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, and to what extent perhaps could they be, even if they have not been yet? Well, I saw Dr. Perkins first.
Well, actually, one of the things I emphasized in the book, but did not talk about, I would argue that the first green revolution, in the sense of high yielding varieties of wheat with good amounts of fertilizer, in fact, was in the state of Washington in the United States. That's where Orville Vogel at Washington State Universities got the varieties from the American occupation of Japan that had the semi-dwarfing genes, and he incorporated them into varieties that grew widely in Washington State. Vogel himself then passed on these seeds to Norman Borlaug in Mexico, where Borlaug immediately saw the utility of them. And one of the other things I did in the book but didn't talk about was the British, for reasons that had interesting analogies to the situation in India about adopting high yielding wheat. The British went full-blown commitment to the Green Revolution technology. A lot of it as their experience from World Wars II and I, when the British at that time were the manufacturing center of the world, and they had developed a food supply system that relied on wheat grown in Canada, the US, and Argentina to feed Britain. And German submarines began to sink those ships arriving in Britain, and Britain was nearly forced to a peace agreement with the Germans, both in the First World War and in the Second. And it was after that war, the British made a firm commitment, never again. And British wheat yields are now among the highest in the world, and they grow with the semi-dwarfing genes. I would argue that the Green Revolution is now essentially standard practice worldwide, both developed nations and the so-called less developed nations.
Thank you. And others?
I would agree. I think the semi-dwarf genes in rice are in U.S. rice varieties and in Australian and Latin Americans. The Sustainable Rice Platform is working with rice growers to develop a chapter in the U.S. The best practices mandated by U.S. Department of Agriculture and various states' departments of agriculture turn out that they align almost perfectly with the Sustainable Rice Platform set of practices. One would hope they would, but they do. And because of the regulatory environment that the U.S. farmer lives in, when they get out of bed in the morning, half of the requirements for sustainably rice are already met just by legislative requirements or in the U.S. So it, as John says, it's becoming the standard practice around the world, and couldn't be sooner.
Dr. Alauddin.
Yes, I'll be very brief, and I can see the evidence of the Green Revolution brand practiced in the developed countries as well. I live in Australia, and I came across a rice variety called Jasmati. It's a cross between jasmine and basmati rice, and it is very tasty. And I used to buy a lot, but since then I have moved on to other varieties of rice. But again, I think the Green Revolution has done a lot to mankind, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world as well. And there has been complementarity between developments in America, developed world, as well as since the 60s, the breeding of rice varieties or wheat varieties in the international research centers. I think, I think it is now a global brand. Green Revolution has become a global brand now, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Dr. Perkins.
Well, just one more point about the sustainability dilemmas that are prevalent around the world because of the high use of fertilizer. Certainly in the United States, it is well known that the heavy nitrogen fertilization in the Midwestern states, mostly for maize production, there's a great deal of runoff of those nutrients into the Mississippi River Valley and into the Gulf of Mexico, which has caused severe pollution, deprivation of the water of oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico. I've not looked at it closely, but my understanding is the same is true in the Bay of Bengal from the heavy fertilization from India and Bangladesh to get the yields needed. So not only is nitrogen fertilizer, it's the source of the high yields, it's the source of air pollution through nitrous oxide that is a greenhouse gas, and it's a water pollutant that can affect fisheries production quite seriously. So for a variety of reasons, sustainability demands research on how do we get the benefits of that nitrogen without polluting the atmosphere and without polluting and destroying the aquatic resources that are very important for adequate diets in many parts of the world.
Thank you. Because it is a little past our time, I'm going to, I think, cut off the concluding statements. Please forgive me. I would have asked you for 30 or 60 seconds on concluding statements, but I think out of deference to our audience, I think I will forego that. Please forgive, and go straight to, thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. To the audience in particular, we do it for you. We can't do it without you. Your questions have fed in and made this discussion go. I just want to say briefly a number of things. One, if you liked this, consider joining the National Association of Scholars. We do a great number of webinar series, among other things. You take a look at our website, but plug for membership. Two, we do a great number of webinars, not only this American Innovation series, but also Right Ideas, other things, other webinar series. We've done American History and Literature. We will do more. No end of stuff from now into the foreseeable future. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you can see all of the American Innovations webinars we have been doing. There's a fine playlist accessible for everybody. I want to say again, if your question wasn't answered, please send email to me, randall@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward your question to the participants so they can have the option to answer you. And again, if you want to see this again, it'll be available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. And again, I am sorry about cutting off the conclusions, but I do. Thank you again. Thank you all so much for taking part in this webinar. It's wonderful, incredibly informative, and I am grateful, and I believe all our audiences as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and I enjoyed the questions and the comments of my fellow speakers.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.
Great pleasure to be a part of this great webinar. Thank you.